This broadcast is part of a fictional program. The station and events depicted are not real. This audio is created for narrative and entertainment purposes only.
This is LWB 1713 AM last warning broadcast. If you can hear this transmission, conditions have already escalated beyond control. Friday, 3:40 in the afternoon. I'm on I-85 North, about an hour outside of Greensboro, doing 72 in the right lane because the left lane has been stop and go since Burlington, and I learned a long time ago that patience on the highway gets you there, the same time as aggression does. Radio's on. Some classic rock station I found around Mebane. Tom Petty, Free Fallon, not my favorite, but good enough for a drive. Window cracked about an inch because the AC in this truck has been dying a slow death since March. I keep telling myself I'll get it fixed, and I keep not getting it fixed. I'm going to pick up Claire. She's 9. She's at her mother's in Kernersville, which is about 40 minutes from where I am now if traffic cooperates. It's my weekend every other Friday to Sunday. I've had this rhythm for 2 years, and it still doesn't feel like enough. But it's what the court gave me, and I show up every time. I have never been late. Not once. That matters to me, even when it doesn't seem to matter to anyone else. The bed of my truck has 2 toolboxes and a cooler with sandwiches and juice boxes because Claire likes to eat on the drive back, and she's particular about what she drinks. Apple juice, not grape. She'll tell you, grape tastes like medicine. She's right, honestly. I mention all this because I want you to understand what kind of afternoon it was. The kind where nothing is wrong. The kind where you're just driving, and the sun is doing that thing where it's behind you so the road ahead looks clean, and you're thinking about whether your kid will want to go to the park tomorrow or if she'll want to stay in and draw, and you're not worried about anything except maybe the AC and whether you remembered to buy the right juice. That's where I was. That's the last normal minute I remember. 3:41, the radio dropped. Not static. I want to be clear about that. When a station cuts out, you get fuzz. You get that hiss between channels. This wasn't that. This song was mid-chorus. Tom Petty holding a note, and then the note thinned, like someone was pulling it apart. The high end went first. The guitar lost its brightness, then the vocal turned muddy, and then there was just the bass and the kick drum, and then nothing. Not silence exactly. The station was still there in some sense. The tuner didn't lose the signal, but whatever was coming through had no content. A carrier wave with nothing on it. I reached for the dial, turned it. Station after station, the same. Some of them had voices still, but the voices were wrong, muffled, compressed, like hearing someone speak through a heavy door. And then I noticed the wind. The crack in my window had been producing a thin whistle since I got on the highway. That whistle was gone. I could still hear air moving, a kind of low rush, but the sharp part, the whine of it, had been cut clean out, like someone had reached into the air and removed a frequency from it. I rolled the window down all the way, 72 miles an hour, with the window full open. What I heard was less than what I should have heard. The road noise was there, but it was reduced, muted, like someone had stuffed cotton into the afternoon. The engine was still running. I could feel it in the pedals and the steering column, but the higher register of it, the mechanical whine that tells you what gear you're in, that was gone. I thought it was my ears. That was the first explanation. Something medical, a pressure thing. I started swallowing, yawning with my jaw open, trying to pop whatever needed popping. Nothing changed. Then I looked at the road ahead and saw brake lights, not the normal kind, not the slow-building accordion of traffic. Every car I could see, everyone, was braking at the same time, like a signal had been sent, and people were pulling over both lanes, cars drifting to the shoulder with their hazards on. I counted 4, then 8, then I stopped counting because I was doing it too. Whatever this was, it wasn't my ears. I pulled off behind a silver minivan with a UNC sticker on the back window, killed the engine, got out. The first thing was the wrongness of the air. I've been on job sites next to highways for 20 years. I know what the shoulder of an interstate sounds like. Tires on asphalt, wind displacement, engine noise and waves, doors, horns. All of it layered into a single continuous wall of sound that you stop hearing after a while, because your brain files it as background. That wall had a hole in it. The top half was missing. Everything above a certain pitch had been removed as cleanly as if you'd drawn a line across a mixing board and muted everything north of it. What was left was low, subterranean almost. Rumbles, thuds, the bass note of trucks passing in the far lane, but no squeal of brakes, no high rev of engines downshifting, no voices carrying the way they do on open road. People were out of their cars. I could see that. A woman in a blue dress, 2 vehicles ahead, was holding her phone to her ear, her mouth moving fast, but I couldn't hear her. She was maybe 30 feet away, and her voice wasn't reaching me. Or it was reaching me with the top sheared off, arriving as a kind of rhythmic murmur with no consonants, no edges, like listening to language with all the information removed. A man in a work vest, highway department, maybe, was standing on the median, waving his arms. At approaching traffic, he was yelling. I could see the cords in his neck. What I could hear was a bass register vibration, like a cello string bowed too slowly. The words were gone. I walked toward the minivan. The driver, a woman my age, was standing with her door open and her hands flat on the roof of her car like she was trying to steady herself. She looked at me. I looked at her. I said something, I don't remember what, probably, "Are you okay?" or "What's happening?" And I could feel my voice in my throat and chest, but what came out was thick and dull, and I watched her face to see if she understood me, and she shook her head. Not no. Just, I don't know. We stood there. Two strangers on the shoulder of I-85, surrounded by 100 other strangers, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be loud and inaudible at the same time. The trucker's name was Dale. He was parked about 200 yards ahead, with his rig pulled clean off the road, hazards going, and he had set up a folding chair next to his cab, with a CB handset wired to an antenna that looked like he'd built it himself, which he probably had. There were already 6 or 7 people standing around him when I walked up. The CB still worked. That was the first important thing. Whatever was happening to sound in the open air, radio transmission, was still carrying. Not well. The voices coming through were compressed and muddy, missing their high end the same way everything else was. But you could make out words. You could understand. And what the voices were saying was this: it's everywhere. Not just this stretch of highway, not just North Carolina, reports from Atlanta, from Northern Virginia, from someone on a fishing boat off Hatteras. A woman in Pennsylvania whose voice cut in and out said every dog in her neighborhood had gone quiet. A man in Tennessee said his hearing aid was dead. Not the battery the device was receiving, but there was nothing in the frequency range it was designed to amplify. Dale had a face like a catcher's mitt and hands that hadn't been clean in a decade. He told me he'd been driving rigs for 31 years and had never pulled over for anything except an engine fire in 2004. He was sitting in his folding chair with the handset against his ear, writing notes on the back of a manifest with a pencil. Just listening, writing. I told him I needed to get to Kernersville, 40 minutes north. My daughter. He looked at me for a long time. Then he went into his cab and came back with a handheld CB unit, the kind you can clip to a belt. Battery-powered. He held it out. Channel 9 for emergencies, Channel 19 for road talk. 14's been the clearest for whatever this is. I took it. You don't need this? I got the one in the cab. And I ain't going anywhere. He looked at the line of stopped cars stretching south to the curve of the highway. Nobody's going anywhere for a while. But if you gotta get to your kid, you gotta get to your kid. I clipped the radio to my belt, got back in my truck, started the engine, and drove into whatever the world was becoming. The first 20 minutes off the shoulder taught me 3 things. 1, traffic was not moving normally, but it was moving. The highway had turned into a slow, cautious procession. Nobody was doing more than 35. Hazard lights everywhere, which was strange because you could barely hear them clicking. The turn signal tick in my own truck had become a felt thing, not a heard thing, a faint pulse in the dashboard. I could sense through my fingertips on the steering wheel, but couldn't pick up with my ears. 2, the cutoff was still dropping. When it started, I'd lost everything above maybe 4,000 or 5,000 hertz. By the time I was back on the road, the ceiling was lower. Voices on the CB were losing their intelligibility. Words that relied on high-frequency consonants, anything with an S, a T, and F, were dissolving. People sounded like they were speaking through water. I could still make out meaning if they talked slowly, if they over-enunciated, but it required effort, concentration. Every transmission was a translation problem. 3. It was moving, not just dropping uniformly everywhere at once. The reports coming through the CB were staggered. A man outside Raleigh said it had started there at 3:38. A woman in Roanoke said 3:44. Someone in Knoxville said 3:51. Dale, still parked on the shoulder behind me, came on channel 14 and said he'd been tracking the timestamps, and it was spreading east to west at roughly 600 miles an hour. Like a weather front, he said, except weather fronts don't move at 600 miles an hour, and they don't selectively erase frequency bands from the audible spectrum. I asked if anyone had heard from official channels. NOAA, FEMA, the National Weather Service, anything. Long pause. Then a voice I hadn't heard before, an older man with what was left of a Midwest accent, said, NOAA's emergency broadcast went to carrier only about 12 minutes ago. Same as FM. They're transmitting, but there's nothing on the signal. I've been monitoring their frequency since this started, and what I can tell you is they didn't go off the air. The air went off them. That's how he said it. The air went off them. And even through the static and the compression and the dying frequency range of the CB, I understood exactly what he meant. The sound wasn't failing because the equipment was broken. The equipment was fine. The medium was broken. The air itself had stopped carrying. I got off at the Haynes Mall Boulevard exit. Because the highway had slowed to a crawl and the surface streets looked clearer, and because I was passing Baptist Hospital and something made me pull in. I don't know what. Maybe the fact that the parking lot was already full and people were standing outside the emergency entrance in a way that didn't look like waiting. It looked like witnessing. I pulled into a visitor spot and got out. There were maybe 60 people in the ER lot, staff in scrubs, patients in gowns, visitors, security guards, all standing, all facing roughly the same direction, which was nowhere in particular. They were just outside, because outside was where you went when you needed to check if the world was still real. A nurse was sitting on the curb with her face in her hands, not crying, I could tell because I was close enough to see her shoulders and they weren't shaking, just sitting, processing. An orderly next to her was mouthing words to a woman in a wheelchair, leaning close, speaking directly into her ear with his lips almost touching it, and the woman was nodding slowly, reading his face more than hearing him. I walked toward the ER entrance. The automatic doors were open. Inside was, I don't know how to describe what a hospital sounds like when you remove most of its sound. Monitors were still beeping, but the beeps were thick and low, like someone had slowed them to half speed. Voices carried as vibrations, not language. The PA system was useless. Someone had started writing on a whiteboard near the nurse's station, in large block letters. All cardiac monitors functioning. Alarms set to visual. Stay calm, stay calm. Written in red marker on a dry erase board in an emergency room where the alarms could no longer be heard. A doctor saw me standing there. I was obviously not a patient, still in my work jeans and boots, and walked over. He said something. I watched his mouth. I caught maybe a third of it. Something about whether I needed help. I said I was just passing through, trying to get to Kernersville. He pointed north and gave me a thumbs up, which was the most useful medical consultation I've ever received. On the way back to my truck, I passed a man sitting in the driver's seat of a parked ambulance with the door open. He was staring at the dashboard. The radio was on. I could see the lights on the unit moving, channels active, transmissions incoming, but the speaker was producing almost nothing, a low hum where dispatch used to be. He looked at me and said, or rather I read on his face, "It's all like this." I believed him. Let me try to describe what was left by 4:30 that afternoon, roughly 50 minutes into whatever this was. Low sounds still existed. You could hear a door close if it was heavy. You could hear the engine of of a truck if it was a diesel. You could feel bass through the ground, through your feet, through your chest if you were close enough to the source. Subwoofer range vibrations were untouched. The world still had weight. Mid-range was fading. Human voice was in the mid-range. This was the cruelest part of it. At 341, you could shout and be heard at 20 feet. By Forcombe, you had to be within arm's length and speaking slowly. By 4:30, voice-to-voice communication required physical contact, a hand on the shoulder, mouth near the ear, and even then the words arrived as tonal shapes, not language. You could tell if someone was asking a question by the rise of the pitch. You couldn't tell what the question was. High frequencies were gone entirely. Birds were silent, not because they'd stopped singing, but because their frequencies no longer propagated. The same for crickets, for the whine of power lines, for the sizzle of a traffic light changing. Car alarms were invisible. Smoke detectors were invisible. A child's scream was invisible. That one stopped me. I was driving through a residential neighborhood off Jonestown Road, taking back routes toward Kernersville, and I passed a playground. There were kids on it, small ones, and a woman was running toward the swings, with arms out and her mouth wide open, and I knew with absolute certainty that she was screaming for a child who had fallen, and I couldn't hear a single part of it. Not the scream, not the cry, nothing. I pulled over. I watched her reach the child. She scooped him up. He was fine. He was holding his elbow, but he was fine. You could see it in his body, the way he curled into her and then straightened up almost immediately, with that resilience kids have. But she didn't know he was fine until she had him in her arms, because she couldn't hear him tell her. I sat in my truck with the window down and the CB crackling its low, dying murmur, and I thought, this is what we lose first. Not infrastructure, not government, not order. We lose the scream, the thing that tells us someone needs help. At 4:47, the floor dropped again. I was on Route 66 heading into Kernersville when it happened, and the only reason I know the exact time is because I'd been checking my phone obsessively, not for signal, which was gone, but for the clock, because time was becoming the only measurement I trusted. The mid-range went, not gradually this time. The first wave had been a slow erosion, like a tide going out frequency by frequency. The second wave was a cliff. One moment I could still hear the low end of my engine, the rumble of the tires, a kind of felt hum from the world around me. The next moment that was halved. The bass dropped in register, or the threshold of audibility larged downward. I don't know the technical way to say it. What I know is that my truck, which had been audible as a low grumble, became audible only as a vibration in the seat. The road noise vanished. The steering column, the suspension, the rattle of the toolboxes in the bed, all of it fell below the line. I pulled over again. I had to, because driving without sound cues is survivable at 30 miles an hour when you've still got some low-frequency orientation. Driving without any sound at all is something else. Your spatial awareness collapses. You don't realize how much of your sense of speed, of distance, of the road around you depends on what you hear until you hear nothing. And your vision has to take over completely, and your vision isn't that fast enough. I sat in the truck on the shoulder of Route 66, and I turned off the engine because there was no point in hearing it since I couldn't hear it anyway. And I picked up the CB and pressed the button and said, "Is anyone still on this channel?" What came back was almost nothing. A low electrical throb. Maybe a voice, maybe not. I couldn't tell if the CB had finally lost its ability to transmit in any usable range, or if the person on the other end was speaking in frequencies that no longer existed in the air between their mouth and the microphone. I pressed the button again. My name is Marcus Boone. I'm on Route 66 outside Kernersville, North Carolina. I'm trying to reach my daughter. If anyone can hear me, I'm about 15 minutes from her mother's house. I'm going to keep driving. I don't know if anyone heard that. I don't know if the radio carried it, or if it died between the handset and the antenna. But I said it anyway because saying things to nobody is still better than not saying them. I know that now. I started the engine, felt it turn over through the frame, drove the rest of the way in total silence. The intersection of Main Street and Old Winston Road, in Kernersville, is controlled by a traffic light. I've been through it probably 400 times. It is the most unremarkable intersection in the Piedmont Triad. 3 gas stations, a Bojangles, and a credit union. At 5:15 on this Friday afternoon, it was the most dangerous place I'd ever been. The traffic light was still working. I could see it change. Green, yellow, red. The problem was that every behavioral system humans have built around traffic lights includes sound. You hear the car in the lane next to you accelerate when the light turns green. You hear the horn that tells you you've drifted. You hear brakes, tires, the Doppler shift of someone running a red. None of that existed. What existed was a 4-way intersection full of vehicles being driven by people who could see the lights, but couldn't hear each other, and therefore couldn't predict each other. 2 cars had already collided in the middle, a low-speed impact, both still drivable, but the drivers were standing between them having an argument that consisted entirely of gestures, because neither one could hear the other. I inched through, windows down even though it made no difference, hands tight on the wheel, scanning left, right, left, watching wheels, not faces. Wheels tell you what a car is about to do better than the driver's expression does. If the front tires are angled, they're about to move. If they're straight and the brake lights are off, they might move. That's all you have when you can't hear. I made it through. On the other side, I passed a Walgreens where someone had taped a handwritten sign to the front door. "We are open. We cannot hear you. Please write down what you need." That sign has stayed with me. Not because it was dramatic, because it was practical. Someone in that Walgreens, some manager, some shift lead, some 22-year-old making $14 an hour, had already adapted. The world had lost sound an hour and a half ago, and this person had already found paper and a marker and made a system. I think about that a lot, about how the first response to something impossible isn't collapse. It's a sign on a door. But then I passed the elementary school two blocks later, and the sign on that door was different. It said, "Children inside. We cannot contact parents. If you are a parent, come inside." And under it, someone had added in smaller letters, "Please." I almost stopped. I thought about Claire's school, which was different from this one, which was in Kernersville proper, and would have let out at 3:15 before this started. She'd have been home. She'd have been with her mother. She was fine. She was fine. I drove past the school. I have thought about that decision every day since. Whether the right thing was to stop. I didn't stop. I'll carry that. 3 blocks past the school, on the left, Faith Lutheran. I know it because Claire went to vacation Bible school there 2 summers ago, and I sat in the parking lot for a week reading paperbacks while she made crafts inside. The doors were open now, and there were people in the lot, maybe 30 of them, and as I slowed to navigate around a car that had stalled diagonally across the lane, I saw what they were doing. They were singing. I could see it in their bodies, the posture, the open mouths, the way their chests expanded in unison. A woman at the front was conducting with her hands. They were arranged in rough rows, hymnals open, heads up, mouths moving together in what I can only describe as the shape of a song performed into a void. I couldn't hear any of it. Not a note, not a vibration. 30 human voices aimed at the sky, and the sky swallowed everyone. I watched for maybe 10 seconds as I rolled past. One man in the back row had his eyes closed and his hands at his sides, and tears running down his face, and his mouth never stopped moving. He was singing. He couldn't hear himself sing. He couldn't hear the person next to him. He couldn't hear the hymn, but his body knew the song, and his lungs were pushing air, and his vocal cords were doing what they'd always done, and whether the air carried it or not was not his department. I want to say that was beautiful. I think it was. But the word that comes first is unbearable, because what I was watching was not worship. It was refusal. Those people were parking lot, those standing in a parking lot insisting that their voices mattered, even though the physical universe had decided otherwise, and the gap between their insistence and the reality of the silence was so wide that watching it felt like watching someone set a table for the dead. They didn't know what had happened. Nobody did. It was 90 minutes old. We didn't have language for it yet. We didn't have explanations or categories or official statements. We had a parking lot and a hymn, and the total absence of the sound that hymn was supposed to make. I drove on. The CB on my belt was dead weight now. I tried it twice since the second wave, and got nothing. Not static, not voices, not carrier tone. The radio spectrum, like the audible spectrum, was being hollowed out from the top down. Whatever was left was below what any receiver I had could convert to meaningful signal. I was alone in a way I had never been alone, and I was 7 minutes from Claire. I need to tell you about what was happening to people. Not the emergency workers, not the organized responses, not the signs on doors, the unstructured behavior, the drift. As I drove through residential streets toward Lauren's house, Lauren is my ex-wife, I passed through neighborhoods I've known for years. Split levels, ranches, the occasional two-story colonial with a basketball hoop in the driveway. Normal places, Friday afternoon places. People were outside. Almost everyone was outside, and they were clustering. Not in any organized way, not moving toward a destination. They were gravitating toward each other, the way animals do when the barometric pressure drops. Families on lawns, find neighbors in driveways, small groups at mailboxes and street corners, standing close, much closer than normal conversation distance, because the only way to communicate was proximity and touch and lip reading, and even that was barely working. And here's what I noticed. Nobody was alone. I drove 6 blocks and did not see a single person standing by themselves. Everyone had found someone, or someone had found them. The isolation that the silence should have created, the walled-off loneliness of not being able to speak or hear, had produced the opposite. People were pressing closer together, not pulling apart, shoulders touching, hands on arms, faces inches from faces. I saw a teenager, 16 maybe, sitting on the curb with an elderly woman I assumed was his grandmother. He was holding her hand with both of his, not talking, just holding. She was looking straight ahead with an expression I recognized because I'd seen it in the mirror at 4:47. Not fear, not calm, just a total blankness where the processing power had been overwhelmed and the system had defaulted to stillness. I saw 2 men, I'd guess were neighbors, standing in a driveway with a pad of paper between them, passing a pen back and forth, writing fast. One of them was shaking his head. The other kept writing. Whatever the information was, it was urgent, and the pen was the only way to move it. I saw a woman standing in her front yard holding a baby against her chest. The baby's face was red, mouth open, crying with everything a baby has, which is considerable, and producing nothing the ear could detect. The woman was bouncing, rocking, doing the motion, but her face was, I need to find the right word, demolished. Because the feedback loop was broken. The bounce, the rock, the shush, all of it depends on hearing the cry decrease, on hearing the soothing work. She was performing comfort into a vacuum and getting no signal back about whether it was reaching the child. That's what the silence did. It didn't make people stop talking or stop trying. It made every attempt to connect a one-way transmission with no confirmation of receipt. You send and send and send, and nothing comes back, and you don't stop sending. Because what else is there? I have to talk about the overpass. Piney Grove Road crosses over Business 40. I was on Piney Grove heading north, and as I came up the approach, I saw a man standing on the pedestrian rail of the overpass, not on the sidewalk, on the rail, facing outward, arms at his sides. I stopped the truck. I don't know how long he'd been there. His posture was still deliberate. He was wearing khakis and a blue polo shirt, work clothes, office clothes, and his shoes were on the sidewalk behind him, placed neatly side by side, which is the detail that told me this was not a man who had climbed up to look at the view. I got out. I walked toward him, slowly, because I didn't want to startle him, and because I didn't know what I was going to do when I reached him. In a normal world, you shout. You say hey or don't or talk to me. You use your voice as a rope. You throw it across the distance and hope the person grabs it. I had no rope. I had no voice that could carry 10 feet. I had my body and my face, and whatever he could read in my approach, I got within about 15 feet, and he turned his head, looked at me. His face was dry, composed, not panicked, not grieving. He looked like a man who had done the math on something and arrived at a number he didn't like but trusted. I held up my hands. Not in surrender, in, I don't know, presence. I'm here. I see you. That's all I could transmit. He looked at me for a long time. Then he looked back out at the highway below, which was a slow river of headlights and brake lights in both directions, soundless. I took a step closer, then another. I got close enough that I could have reached out and touched his leg if I'd extended my arm fully. I didn't. I stood there and I looked up at him, and I waited. He looked down at me again. His mouth moved. I watched it. I couldn't hear a word. But the shape of what he said was short. One syllable, maybe two. Okay, or don't, or help, or gone. He stepped down. He stepped backward off the rail, onto the sidewalk, and sat down next to his shoes. He put his face in his hands. I sat down next to him. I put my hand on his back. I could feel his ribs moving with his breathing. We sat there for about 2 minutes. Then I pointed to my truck. He shook his head. I pointed again. He shook his head again. I left him there. I had to. Claire was 5 minutes away. That's another one I carry. 2 blocks from Lauren's house, a man I recognized. Dave Ostrowski lives on the corner of Elm and Birch. I've waved to him from the truck 100 times on pickup days. Was standing in the middle of the street with a push broom held horizontally like a barricade. I stopped. He walked to my window, leaned in close, spoke directly into my ear with his mouth almost touching it. What I heard was the ghost of a voice, the fundamental frequency, the resonance of his chest cavity transmitted through 4 inches of air into my ear canal. No words, but I felt the pattern, the rhythm of a sentence, a question, a concerned human being asking me something. I spoke back the same way, leaning out my window, mouth to his ear. I'm picking up Claire. Is Lauren's house? Are people okay down there? I don't know how much he got. He pulled back, looked at my face. Then he pointed down the street toward Lauren's house and held up his hand flat, palm down, and moved it in a steady horizontal line. Level. Okay. Stable. Then he held up the broom and pointed at the street and made a sweeping gesture that clearly meant, I'm keeping this block together. I'm doing what I can. This is my post. Dave Ostrowski. Retired postal worker. Standing in the street with a broom, because when civilization is functional, order comes from institutions, and when it isn't, it comes from a 68-year-old man who decides that his corner is going to stay organized whether anyone can hear him or not. I gave him a thumbs up. He gave me one back. I drove the last 2 blocks. Lauren's house is a Cape Cod with blue shutters on a cul-de-sac. There's a dogwood in the front yard that Claire helped me plant when she was 4, back when Lauren and I were still trying. It's taller than me now. The house was there. The lights were on. Lauren's car was in the driveway. The front door was closed, but the living room curtains were open, and I could see movement inside. I parked, turned off the engine, sat in the absolute silence for 3 seconds. Then I got out, and I walked to the front door, and I knocked, because knocking is what you do, even when nobody can hear a knock, even when the sound of your fist on wood drops dead an inch from the surface. You knock, the motion matters, even if the sound doesn't. The door opened. Lauren was standing there, and behind her in the hallway was Claire. Here's what I learned in the first 10 minutes inside that house. Lauren had been home since 3:20. Claire had gotten off the bus at 3:15. The silence had hit while they were in the kitchen, Claire doing homework, and Lauren starting dinner. Lauren said, or rather, wrote on the pad of paper that was already sitting on the kitchen counter, already half full of messages, that the first thing she noticed was the smoke alarm. They'd been cooking, and the pan had gotten too hot, and the smoke alarm should have beeped, and it didn't. Claire's account, also written in her careful 4th-grade handwriting. The TV got quiet, and then the birds got quiet, and then everything got quiet, and I thought I went deaf, but Mom couldn't hear either, so we both went deaf at the same time, which doesn't make sense. She's not wrong. It doesn't make sense, but Claire has a gift for stating the obvious in a way that makes it land harder than any expert analysis. We both went deaf at the same time, which doesn't make sense. That's the whole thing. That's the entire phenomenon compressed into a 9-year-old sentence. I hugged her. I picked her up, even though she's getting too big for that. And I held her, and she held me, and I could feel her mouth moving against my shoulder. She was talking, saying something into my shirt. I couldn't hear it, but I could feel the vibration of her voice through the bone of my shoulder and the fabric of my jacket. And for 1 second, just one, I caught something. Not words, a tone. The fundamental frequency of my daughter's voice, transmitted through direct physical contact, bone to bone. I set her down and put my hands on her shoulders and leaned my forehead against hers. "Can you hear me?" I said it as quietly as I could, because volume didn't help, air wasn't carrying, but closeness might. She shook her head. Then she pressed her forehead harder against mine, and I spoke again, and I felt her eyes widen. She pulled back and grabbed the pad and wrote, "I heard something, like humming, when our heads touched. Bone conduction. Sound traveling not through air, but through solid material. Skull to skull, it was faint. It was just the lowest overtones, but it was there. It was the first real communication I'd had in 2 hours. Lauren and I have a complicated relationship, which is a generous way of saying we have a hostile one, managed through politeness, but that evening none of it mattered. She wrote on the pad, "Stay tonight. We need another adult here." And I wrote back. I wasn't leaving. The neighborhood was handling it the way neighborhoods do, unevenly. Through the front window I could see the Garcias across the street had set up a folding table in their driveway with a camping lantern and a stack of paper and pens. Their door was open. People were drifting in and out. 3 houses down, the Miller's place was dark and shut. The Andersons had a generator running. I couldn't hear it, but I could see the exhaust, and the lost and the light were on in a way that suggested powered equipment. Mrs. Kim, from the end of the cul-de-sac, was walking house to house to house with a flashlight, even though it was still light out, knocking on doors, checking on people. Lauren had been in contact, written contact, with 4 neighbors. The general state of knowledge as of 6 p.m., nobody knew what was happening. Cell service was down. Internet was down. Probably because the local infrastructure depended on frequencies that no longer functioned. Though I'm guessing about the technical reason. Television was displaying images but producing no audio. Radio was dead across all bands. The only new piece of information came from Tom Ahern, 2 doors down, who was a ham radio enthusiast and had equipment in his garage that could transmit and receive on very low frequencies, VLF, the kind the Navy uses to communicate with submarines. Tom had written on a piece of cardboard in large letters and walked it to each house on the cul-de-sac. "Wolf's still working. Navy frequencies. Active official traffic detected. They know. They don't know why. They know. They don't know why." 6 words that told us the federal government was aware and helpless, which is exactly the combination you don't want. Lauren made dinner in silence, actual silence. Not the polite avoidance we'd perfected over 2 years of custody exchanges. Silence because there was no other option. She cooked pasta on the stove, and I set the table, and Claire sat at the counter drawing with colored pencils, and the 3 of us moved around that kitchen like a family, which we hadn't been in a long time, and the absence of sound made the absence of everything else between Lauren and me feel both enormous and irrelevant. We ate together, Claire between us. Forks against plates, felt but not heard. It was the quietest meal of my life in every possible meaning of that word. Communication became architecture. That's the only way I can describe what happened in the hours after the second wave killed the last usable frequencies. The pad of paper on Lauren's counter became the household's central nervous system. Every thought, every question, every instruction moved through it. Going to check windows. Claire needs to brush teeth. Do we have batteries? Is the water still running? The water was still running. The electricity was still on. The gas stove still worked. The refrigerator was still cold. Whatever was eating the sound had not touched the other systems. Not yet. And that not yet hung over everything. Because once you've watched one impossible thing happen, the idea that other impossible things might follow becomes not paranoia, but pattern recognition. Claire adapted fastest, kids do. Within an hour, she had developed a set of hand signals that she taught to Lauren and me with the impatience of a child explaining something obvious to slow adults. 1 finger up, I need something. Flat hand waving, come here. Both hands pressing down, I'm okay. A fist held to the chest, I'm scared. She used the last one twice that evening. Both times I crossed the woman's one, sat next to her and pressed my forehead against hers and hummed, low, low and steady, and felt the vibration pass between us through the bone, and she would close her eyes and breathe, and after a minute, her fist would open and her hand would press down flat against her chest. I'm okay. The writing slowed as the evening went on, not because there was less to say, but because the effort of translating every thought into written language before it could be shared was exhausting in a way I hadn't anticipated. Speaking is effortless. You open your mouth, and the thought becomes sound, and the sound crosses the air and arrives. Writing requires you to finish the thought before you transmit it. You have to know what you mean. You can't half say something and adjust based on the other person's reaction. You can't trail off, you can't murmur. By 9 p.m., we were mostly sitting in the living room, not writing, not trying to communicate, just being in the same room. And I realized that this was what silence actually costs. Not information, not efficiency. It costs the casual, unstructured, meaningless small talk that is actually the thing holding people together. The nothing words, the and the yeah, and the sigh. Those were gone. And the space they left was vast. I couldn't sleep. Lauren had set me up on the couch. Claire was in her room. The house was dark. And the silence, I need to describe this because it's different from anything you've experienced. You've been in quiet places, libraries, empty churches, a field at midnight, but those places have sound. They have the hum of electrical systems, the creak of a building settling, the distant drone of a highway, the white noise of air moving through ducts. Your brain registers those sounds below the level of consciousness and files them as silence because they carry no information. But they're there. They're the floor under the quiet. That floor was gone. What I was lying in on Lauren's couch at 11 p.m. was the total absence of auditory input. Not quiet, not muffled, not dampened. Absence. The acoustic equivalent of absolute darkness. My ears were receiving nothing, and the brain does not handle this well. Within 20 minutes, I was hearing things that weren't there. Not hallucinations, or maybe exactly hallucinations. A high, thin tone that seemed to originate inside my skull. A rhythmic pulse that I eventually realized was my own blood moving through vessels near my eardrums. In an anechoic chamber, you hear these things after about 30 minutes. I'd read that somewhere years ago. Thought it was interesting. Interesting is not the word for experiencing it in your ex-wife's living room while the world outside has stopped making sound. The tinnitus, the phantom tone, got louder as the night went on. Or my perception of it sharpened because there was nothing else competing for attention. Either way, by midnight my head was a single sustained note, a ringing that existed only inside my nervous system, produced by my own auditory cortex trying to fill the void. I got up, walked to the window, looked outside. The street was dark, not power outage dark. The streetlights were on, but activity dark. No cars, no movement, every house sealed. And above it, the sky, full of stars in a way I hadn't seen from a suburban neighborhood in my life, because there was no sound. And I know sound doesn't affect starlight. I know that's not how it works. But something about the total silence made the sky look different, closer, more present, as if the atmosphere itself had thinned. I pressed my hand against the window glass, cold. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. I pressed my forehead against the glass and hummed, the way I'd hummed with Claire, and felt the vibration travel into the pane and disappear. Where did it go? Where does sound go when the air won't carry it? Does it just stop? Does the energy convert to heat, to motion, to something else? Or does it simply cease to exist at the boundary of whatever field or phenomenon or wall has been dropped over us? I don't know. I stood at that window for an hour, listening to the inside of my own head, and I don't know. At 2:14 a.m., I was still awake, still on the couch, watching the clock on Lauren's mantel because time was my anchor. The third wave hit. I know it hit because the phantom tone in my head changed. It didn't get louder, it got shorter. The sustained ringing that had been my only auditory companion for hours began to stop, to break apart into segments, as if the frequency it occupied was being compressed from both sides. And then my heartbeat disappeared. I'd been hearing it, feeling it, in my ears since the ambient sound had died. that low, steady thud of my own circulatory system. It had been there for hours, and at 2:14 a.m. it stopped being audible. I put my hand on my chest. My heart was still beating. I could feel it in my palm. But the sound of it, the internal sound, the one conducted through my own body, through my own bones and tissue and fluid, was gone. I swallowed. The click of my throat, the sound of my own saliva, gone. I moved my jaw, ground my teeth together. The sound that should have resonated through my skull, through my mandible, and into my inner ear, gone. The third wave had crossed the last barrier. It was inside the body now, not just the air between people, not just the medium of communication, but the internal acoustic environment. The sounds your body makes to itself, the ones you never think about because they're always there. The heartbeat, the breath, the gut, the creak of a joint, the subaudible hum of a living system operating, all of it, gone. I sat up on the couch, in a dark house, in absolute silence, absolute, genuine, complete silence, the kind that shouldn't be survivable because human consciousness was not designed to operate in the total absence of auditory input. And I felt something I've never felt before, and hope to never feel again. I felt like I had been unplugged from my own body, like the connection between my mind and my physical self had been severed at the audio channel, and what remained was a consciousness floating in a structure it could see and feel, but no longer here operating. I couldn't confirm my own heartbeat through my ears. I couldn't confirm my own breathing. I was alive only on the evidence of my moving chest and the pulse in my wrist and the warmth of my own skin, and all of that was visual and tactile, and none of it was auditory. And the absence was so total that for about 30 seconds I wasn't sure I was still real. Then Claire's door opened down the hall, and she came running. She hit me at full speed, arms around my waist, face in my stomach, whole body pressed against mine. I could feel her shaking. I put my hands on her back and held her and felt her ribs heaving and knew she was crying, sobbing, and the sound that should have been the loudest thing in my world was nothing. A vibration in her chest, a shudder in her shoulders, but no sound. Lauren was right behind her. She appeared in the hallway in her robe, moving fast, and in the dim light from the street lamp through the window I could see her face, and it was the face of a woman who had woken up to something worse than what she'd fallen asleep to, and didn't have the tools to fix it. I pointed to my ear, then to my chest. Then I shook my head. She understood. I watched the understanding land. Her hand went to her own throat. She swallowed. I could see the motion. She pressed her fingers under her jaw where the pulse point is. Then she looked at me, and her mouth formed a word I could read even in the dark because it was only 2 letters. No. I shook my head again. I mouthed, inside too. It took the inside sounds. She sat down on the couch next to me. Claire was between us. We held her. We held each other, technically, because when you're holding a child from both sides, there's no way to avoid the other person's arms, and in that moment, neither of us wanted to avoid them. I pressed my forehead to Claire's, hummed, pushed every bit of vibration I could generate through my chest and my skull and into hers, and for the first time, nothing passed. The bone conduction that had been our lifeline 6 hours ago was gone. The third wave had taken that too. I was touching my daughter. Our foreheads were together, and the distance between us was total. She pulled back. I could barely see her face in the dark, but I could see enough. She wasn't panicking. She looked at me with an expression that was older than 9, steady searching, like she was solving a problem. She put her hands on my cheeks, held my face. Then she opened her mouth and spoke. I watched her lips. I couldn't hear a single thing, but I watched the shapes, and I read them. I can feel you breathing. She could. Her hands were on my face, and my breath was moving across her fingers, and the warmth and rhythm of it was carrying information that sound no longer could. I spoke back, slowly. I am right here. She read my lips. I know she did because she nodded. And then she did something that I will remember for the rest of my life. She took my hand and placed it flat against her chest, over her heart, and she took her other hand and placed it flat against my chest, over mine. 2 hearts, neither audible, both felt. She held that position and looked at me, and her face said, "This is how we do it now." I want to tell you that I was strong in that moment, that I was the parent, the adult, the steady one, but I wasn't. I was falling apart in every way except physically. The tears were silent, obviously, and the shaking in my chest was silent, and the grief, because that's what it was, grief, not fear, grief for every sound I would never hear again, starting with my daughter's voice, was absolutely silent. And she felt all of it through her hand on my chest, and she didn't pull away. Lauren put her hand on my shoulder. I put my free hand over hers. 3 people in a dark living room, connected by touch, each feeling the other's heartbeats through their palms because the air between us had been emptied of the ability to carry anything at all. I don't know how long we sat like that. Long enough for Claire to fall asleep between us, her hands still in position, one on my chest and one on Lauren's. Long enough for my breathing to slow down and match the rhythm of hers. Long enough for the phantom ringing in my head to finally completely stop, which left nothing, true nothing, the quietest any human being has ever been. Around 4 a.m., Claire woke up and pulled me off the couch. She was tugging my hand, urgent, her face animated in a way that meant she'd thought of something. She pulled me to the basement door. Lauren followed. The basement in Lauren's house is unfinished. Concrete floor, cinder block walls, water heater in the corner. Claire had been down there earlier in the evening. Lauren confirmed this with a nod, and now she was pulling us down the stairs with a determination that was almost frantic. At the bottom, she dropped to her knees on the concrete floor. She pressed her ear flat against it. Then she looked up at us and her eyes were wide and she was nodding. I got down, pressed my ear to the cold concrete, and I felt something, not heard. Felt a vibration so low it was below anything I'd normally register. Below bass, below subbass. A frequency that traveled through the foundation and the earth beneath it and into the temporal bone of my skull through direct contact. It was rhythmic, slow, steady, like a pulse but deeper and longer than a heartbeat. A cycle every 4 or 5 seconds. Rising, falling, rising, falling. Lauren got down next to us, pressed her ear to the floor. After a few seconds, she lifted her head and looked at me, and her face was a question I could read. What is that? I didn't know. I don't know. It was coming from below, through the ground, through the crust of the earth itself, maybe. Some vibration low enough to survive whatever had stripped everything else away. The world wasn't silent. That's what Claire had figured out before any adult on the planet. She'd gone to the basement and pressed her ear to the floor and found what was left. It wasn't sound. Not in any way we use the word. But it was something. The earth was still moving, and if you got low enough and pressed yourself against it, you could feel it. When I came back upstairs with Claire and Lauren, the first gray light of Saturday morning was coming through the east-facing windows. Pre-dawn. The neighborhood was still dark, still sealed. Claire went to the kitchen and came back with a pot and a wooden spoon. She sat on the floor. She pressed the bottom of the pot flat against the hardwood, and she hit it with the spoon. No sound in the air. Nothing audible to any of us standing above her. But she pressed her free hand against the floor next to the pot and nodded. The vibration was traveling, down through the pot, into the floor, through the joists in the subfloor, and into the structure of the house. Not as sound. As contact. She hit it again. And again, a pattern. 3 hits, pause, 2 hits, pause, 3 hits. Over and over. Lauren looked at me. I knelt down and put my hand on the floor. I could feel it. Faintly but clearly. 3, pause, 2, pause, 3. Claire pointed at the floor. Then she pointed in the direction of the Garcias house next door. She wanted to know if they could feel it, too. I went outside. The air was gray and cool and completely, absolutely silent. No birds, no wind sound, no cars, not even the deep vibrations that had survived the first 2 waves. Just a still gray world, pre-dawn, May, North Carolina, every frequency extinct. I walked to the Garcias' front door. I didn't bother knocking. I knelt down and pressed my hand flat against their concrete porch. 3, pause, 2, pause, 3. Faint, attenuated by distance and material transitions. But there. I pressed the doorbell. No sound, obviously. But a minute later, the door opened and Maria Garcia was standing there with her hand on the doorframe, and I could see in her face that she'd felt it too. I pointed toward Lauren's house. I pointed down. I pressed my hand to the ground. She nodded. She'd already been listening. By noon on Saturday, 12 houses on the cul-de-sac were communicating through the ground. I want you to understand what that means. Not through air, not through radio waves, not through written language, through physical vibration transmitted via direct contact with the structure of the earth, pots on floors, hammers on foundations, hands on concrete, patterns of impact that traveled through wood and stone and soil and arrived, diminished but readable, at the next point of contact. Claire's 323 became the signal for I'm here. Dave Ostrowski, who came over around 8 a.m. with his broom still in hand, worked out a system: 1 for yes, 2 for no, 323 for checking in, 5 rapid hits for emergency. 10 a.m. the system had expanded through the help of Tom Ahern, who brought an actual Navy VLF reference card and started mapping out something resembling Morse code adapted for ground transmission. It was slow. God, it was slow. A sentence took 5 minutes. A question and answer could take 15. Compared to speech, compared to even written notes passed hand to hand, it was glacial. But it worked. And it worked in a way that nothing else did. Because the ground was still carrying. The earth hadn't stopped vibrating. It was the last channel, the lowest one, the one that whatever had emptied the air hadn't reached or couldn't reach or didn't bother with. 23 hours after the world lost sound, a 9-year-old girl with a pot and a wooden spoon reinvented communication from first principles. Not because she understood acoustics, not because she had training or expertise or institutional support, because she hit something against the floor and paid attention to what happened next. That's it. That's the whole method. Hit something. Pay attention. I need to tell you what happened at 1:47 p.m. on Saturday because I don't understand it, and nobody I've communicated with since understands it either. We were on the floor. Most of the cul-de-sac in their own houses, on their own floors, hands and ears down, passing signals through the ground. A network of 12 households connected by vibration. And at 1:47 p.m., a new signal came through, not from any of us. It came from below, deep. The same rhythmic pulse Claire had found at 4 a.m., but stronger now, more defined, as if it had been amplified or as if it was rising. The 4 to 5 second cycle was still there, but it had developed structure. Variations in intensity and duration and the spacing between peaks. It didn't feel random. I pressed my ear to the floor and listened with my bones, and what I felt was organized, patterned, intentional. I looked at Claire. She was lying flat on the living room floor, cheek against the hardwood, hands spread wide, and her eyes were closed, and her face had an expression I can only describe as listening. Real listening, the kind you do with your whole body. She opened her eyes and looked at me and mouthed 2 words. That's answering. I don't know what that means. I don't know what's down there. I don't know if the silence was a weapon or a clearing or a preparation, but something heard us knocking, and it knocked back. I'm writing this because I can't speak it. Nobody can speak anything. It's been 37 hours and counting, and the air is still dead and the sky is still silent, and the only channel left is the one that runs under our feet. I'm writing this on a legal pad in Lauren's kitchen. Claire is on the floor in the next room, tapping. She hasn't stopped since Saturday morning. The whole cul-de-sac is tapping. I can feel their rhythms through the soles of my boots when I stand in the right spot. A dozen different patterns, a dozen households, all of them reaching down instead of out. The pulse from below is getting stronger. Every hour, a little more defined, a little closer to something that has structure, that has grammar, that has intent. I don't know if we called it or if it was always there. I don't know if the silence was the disaster or if the noise was all along, and we just didn't know because we'd never experienced its absence. I don't know what happens when it reaches us, when the thing below finishes rising and the thing above finishes emptying, and they meet somewhere in the middle, with us between them. Claire is on the floor, tapping, and the floor is tapping back, and my daughter is having the first conversation of whatever comes next. I can't hear any of it, but I can feel it in the boards, in the nails, in the foundation, in my teeth. The world went silent, and something underneath it started talking.